And Miao, I want to say hi to you.
Okay, let's
Oh,
start
hi.
I'm
recording.
so excited. Yeah, when I see the title, I said I have to tune in. This is such an interesting title and such an interesting paper.
Oh, thank you very much, Jenny.
Okay. All right, Tara, take it away. Yep.
You got it. Well, good afternoon. I know it's probably morning for several of you. We wanted to thank you and for joining us today for another presentation as a part of the Accounting Design Project. My name is Tara Vakil, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's presentation. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First ask is if you could just mute your microphone for the presentation until you're called upon to ask a question. You can obviously unmute at that point. We also ask that you turn on your video for the presentation so that we can have more active participation. And we're going to be utilizing the chat and the raised hand feature for questions. So Miao is going to take the first 5 minutes of the workshop to present uninterrupted, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'll monitor the chat, so feel free to ask your questions that way as well. Without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce a fellow New Englander, Miao Liu. He's an assistant professor of accounting from Boston College, the Carroll School of Management. He's going to be presenting his research paper titled Narrative Risk Disclosures, Implications for Systemic Risk Exposure and Asset Prices, co-authored with John Bai, Chin Wan, and Zafer Yüksel. Mal, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Tara, for the great introduction. And I really appreciate the opportunity to present this work. Um, and this is our very preliminary first draft of the paper. And so we are on this at the stage where we can benefit the most from feedbacks. This is a four-author team, and I'm the only one in accounting. Um, the other three, John, Chi, and Var, we all live in the same geographic area, and we have kids with similar age. So this paper really come out of a play date for our kids. And as four big nerds without better topics, we talk about research during the play dates, and 2 years later, we have this paper. So let me try to motivate the research question a bit. We know as investors, we care about basically two big things: cash flows and systematic risks when we think about the valuation of companies. And when it comes to systematic risks, what we really care about are two components of it. One is what are the systematic risks and what are the firm's exposures to these systematic risks. And if we figure out what these things are, and classic asset pricing theories such as APT or intertemporal CAPM would give us a very powerful and simple equation that help us to think about the valuation of companies. And if you look at this equation, on the left-hand side, we have expected returns. And on the right-hand side, we have a linear combination of a few items, and each item is an interaction between a particular systematic risk, F, and the stock's exposure or beta to this systematic risk, B. So the intuition is actually very simple. The intuition is if a stock give us a high payoff, which means a positive exposure, positive B, when the state of the economy is going well, a high F, and the low payoff when the economy is going badly, then that stock is pretty risky. Investor can use that stock to hedge the systematic risk and would require a high expected return. So that's the intuition. Then we have a little bit of problem here. The problem is we don't know what are the systematic risks. And if we don't know what the systematic risks are, we don't know how to measure firms' exposures to different systematic risks. So when I was sitting in pharma's class as a first-year PhD student and had absolutely no clue about accounting research, I figured, okay, whatever pharma tells me should be golden. And he said, because we don't know what the systematic risks are, I just go with a ad hoc approach. I come up with 3 factors, and later on I come up with 5 factors without super solid theoretical foundation. But the nice thing is they work. And many years later, I figured, look, you know what the problem is? The problem is we have a measurement problem. We don't know how to measure systematic risks, and we don't know how to measure firms' exposures to systematic risks. And when we have a measurement problem, enter accounts. So that's the whole purpose of this paper. Well, traditionally, people within the CAPM framework use market beta as a measure of systematic risk. But beta is a little problematic because, first of all, it doesn't work empirically. We all know empirically beta is not explaining cross-sectional stock returns. And from a conceptual point of view, beta is always estimated using historical data. And historical data doesn't really capture all these emerging risks that we talk about these days, such as climate risk, pandemic risk, geopolitical risk, and maybe even biodiversity risk. All these emerging risks are, first of all, emerging, are new, and second of all, fast evolving. So past data, past returns and past market portfolio returns, they are not very good at capturing all these newly emerging risks. So what we're going to look at instead are not return or financial data. We're going to look at firms' annual reports and item 1A in firms' annual reports. And we're going to come up with a very simple intuition, trying to capture systematic risks and firms' exposure to systematic risks. The intuition is a risk is more likely to be systematic when lots of firms are talking about this risk in the annual reports. And a firm is more likely to have high exposure to this systematic risk if the firm talks a lot about this systematic risk that many other firms are also talking about. That's the whole idea of our approach. And after measuring these 2 constructs, we're going to test whether our measure of systematic risks and firms' exposure to systematic risks help explain cross-sectional stock returns. Okay, so we have 2 main findings. The first finding is, yes, indeed, what we call the NRD, narrative risk disclosure exposure, helps explain cross-sectional stock returns in that firms that have higher NRD exposure earns higher expected returns, consistent with classic asset pricing models. And the second is, well, investors seem to have difficulty in incorporating information in NRD exposure promptly, in the sense that there is predictability among firms that share the same risk exposure.
Now, I think we have a question right here, which is probably a good spot for Mayun.
Yes, please.
Hello, Miao. I want to go back to kind of the 1 or 2 slides before. I feel like you try to kind of sell your paper as that you are introducing something new above and beyond all the different factors either pharma or the other people have identified. And then the recent literature have showed that there are probably more than 300 or above numeric factors that have been kind of like shown related to future expected return. And then I thought your paper is actually to shed light on the nature of the underlying economic risks that associated with those results instead of introducing number 350 factor to that horse race, right? So I just want to clarify on that is that I feel your measure is actually to shed light on whatever already worked, but like we don't know whether that market beta has become significant. It's driven by what nature of economic events. And then that way you can actually complementary your results with whatever has been established a step instead of like joining the horse race given the set of the statistical significance you have, and then you kind of like tie your hands in that way. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Yes. So what we're trying to do is not horse racing our measure with 300 other measures, but to construct a measure from data, namely item 1A, that is meant to tell us about risks and see if such disclosure, this theory-motivated risk disclosure, actually helps investors um, um, pricing in the information and share risk on the market. Okay, so if I put this paper into the literature, there are two sort of strands of accounting literature that is mainly about risk. The first one is using accounting information to measure systematic risk. And Anya and Stephen, they have quite a few pieces contribution in this literature. And the second is the risk factor disclosure risk literature. What we are trying to bring to the table here is we are not looking at numerical values such as stock returns or earnings in the historical data. What we're trying to see is whether firms' textual or narrative risk disclosure can give us a more comprehensive, if you will, and more timely measure of risk exposure that helps explain cross-sectional stock returns.
Okay, Mel, we have one more question. I'll
Yes,
pause you
go ahead,
there
please.
for.
Hi, Miao. I just wanted to double check with you. So much of the 1A and other narrative risk disclosures come along with hard numbers, especially in the hedging disclosures, where we have solid amounts that have been designated to attack a certain financial risk. And then obviously they have other sensitivities showing which are very valuable given your NRD measure. So I was just wondering, what is the efficacy of those hard numbers? For example, X amount of notional designated to curtail this unfavorable movement. And that is going to extensively be blown up in the narrative that you will pick up as well. So there is something more hardcore and quantifiable that is in the footnotes, in organized places, in the hedging disclosures. Do you think that is correlated with your descriptions, or would you control for it?
Yeah, that's very true. We do have plenty of quantitative information in item 1A, but it's going to be a case-by-case scenario where for a particular firm, whether a particular risk is either idiosyncratic or systematic. Without this prior knowledge, we don't look at specific risks disclosed by specific firms. Instead, we're going to look at if a risks disclosed by a particular firm correlates highly or lowly with all the risks disclosed by lots of other firms without really zooming into specific risk disclosures for a specific firm. Federico.
Hey, Miao, great to see you. I think your paper makes a lot of sense to me. Coincidentally and incidentally, we presented a paper a couple of years ago at ADP, where essentially we were looking at the macroeconomic disclosures within 10K reports, not necessarily and exclusively within item 1A, but throughout the entire report.
Mm-hmm.
And what we were and what we find and what we were finding and describing was that essentially these disclosures capture firms' time varying sensitivity to macroeconomic shocks in a forward-looking sense. And we also find that these disclosures effectively capture priced systematic risk. So you may want to check that out because I think, obviously we're looking at a very specific dimension of information content, which is macro sensitivity, but it's definitely a key dimension of systematic risk. And we find, there are significant asset pricing implications that we added to the paper. I'll add the link to the chat box later. But I think it's going to be relevant for your discussion, especially as you position the paper in the existing literature.
That would be very helpful. Yeah, I'd love to see how these two papers connect and incorporate some of the insights of your paper into mine. Thank you. Okay, so let me go a little bit in details on how we measure the NRD, or narrative risk disclosure exposure. So we focus on item 1A, which becomes a mandatory disclosure item after 2005. So our sample period is after 2005. And then we first use this very well-known NLP method called LDA to sort of reduce the dimension of this of all these texts, and reducing the dimension of thousands and thousands of words into just a handful of topics. So first, we're going to measure a distribution of risk topics for each firm year. That means each 10K. And then we are going to measure the same distribution of risk topics at the market level across all firms. And then with those two distributions, we are going to calculate a similarity, and in particular cosine similarity, between the risk disclosure, risk topic distribution of a particular firm I, and the risk topic distribution of the entire market, pulling all firms. And that will give us a firm by year measure of firm I's NRD exposure. And we're going to test if this measure helps us to explain cross-sectional stock returns. Okay, so how many topics do we pick? We basically follow a data-driven approach. Well, first of all, to give you a little bit of a background, this Dyer et al. Paper in JAE, they classified the entire 10K into 150 topics. Well, we don't look at the entire 10K. We look at item 1A only, and we look at how the data tells us what is the appropriate number of topics. And the data tells us basically 100 topics seems to be the right number, but our result doesn't really depend on this particular choice. If you shrink the number a bit or increase the number a bit, our result doesn't change much.
Frederico's got another question for you, Mel.
Yeah, so just out of curiosity, going back to my research with Gil and Alon and Cameron, so do we truly need an LDA model to identify uh, ex ante reasonable risk factor exposures? The reason why I'm asking is because obviously, it's very intriguing, and obviously it contributes to the literature, applying new techniques or novel techniques to novel settings and contexts, and that's absolutely fine. But to some extent, I'm wondering whether one could identify, using even a simpler approach, certain ex ante significant keywords that would capture ex ante significant risk factor exposures, and develop basically measures of topical content associated with this risk factor exposure. So did you try a keyword-based approach? Was this your first methodology? Could you talk about this? Because I'm very curious.
Yeah, thanks for the question. There are two reasons that we're using this approach. One is if you look at the raw data in item 1A, a lot of words don't really have a strong signal about firms' risks. So we need to sort of have a technique to help us to reduce the dimension from thousands and thousands of words and biograms into just a handful of dimensions. And the second reason is it's not really important to us to ex ante identify topics of risks. because all we need to know is for whatever distribution of risks this firm is talking about, does that distribution have a high correlation to the risk distribution that all the other firms on the market are also talking about? So the advantage of that approach is it doesn't require any prior knowledge from the researchers to ex ante specify for this given year, what are the risks that matter on the market? We don't have that prior. And especially when we talk about emerging risks, such as pandemic, climate, etc., that prior knowledge on researchers seems to be too demanding. That's the second reason why we go with this approach.
Miao, may I follow up with the
Of course.
question? And I
Sure.
agree with Federico that I was surprised to hear that you used LDA. First, the LDA model it's quite messy to use, and my co-authors and I used it in our 2024 car publication. And second, for risk factor disclosure, I have read a lot of risk factor disclosures when I developed my CAR 2018 paper about risk factor disclosure spillover effect. And I noticed that most firms, especially after in recent years, maybe in 2005, not so, but afterwards, I think after a certain year, the SEC advises companies to have a section title for each factor. So if you look at the sample, maybe most of the firms have the factors already organized in sections, one section with one title, subsections. So if a firm has 20 risk factors, they have already labeled the risk factor with the title. And I think typically from my experience, companies discuss one risk in one paragraph. So even if the company did not label the risk factor, and then you could still rely upon the paragraphs that are labeled by the company themselves to infer or to use machine learning to predict and give a label of the paragraphs that companies in the early years did not label. So I feel that this using this company self labeled title might be better than using LDA.
That's a very good point. And yes, so far we never used all these titles companies disclose to help us understand what are the topics that we pick up using LDA. Let me think a little bit more about the best way to bring that information into our approach and sort of help us to break up the black box of LDA a bit. Thank you.
Joshua, I think, is next in line with a question.
Yes, please.
So my question is really piggybacking on Jenny's question. I seem to remember about 3 years ago, somebody at Wharton, a PhD student, did exactly that. He took the risk factors of companies and created topics from them and used it in order to come up with some classification of risk for the firm and looked at subsequent returns. I'm not sure whether, I don't remember the name, but I remember looking at the paper at the time.
Okay. I will find out that paper. I believe I think I know who you are talking about. He's probably now at Florida. He's in the finance department. It's Jenny's colleague. Okay, I'll look into that paper. Okay, indeed, I would say a limitation of this approach is a well-known weakness of LDA. Sometimes it becomes very hard to interpret the topics identified by LDA. Here are some examples. If you look at the first box, it's pretty clear. This is a topic about foreign exchange rate risk. and the second seems to be about risks in the medical sector. And the third seems to be about environmental related risks. But the fourth box, I have no idea how to interpret this topic. It seems to be all sorts of unrelated keywords putting together. So that's a limitation of LDA. But I want to emphasize that from the perspective of the construct that we're trying to capture, which is a firm's the correlation between a firm's risk topic distribution and the market level risk topic distribution, that doesn't require us to be able to interpret all the topics identified by LDA. Yes, Joshua, I have another question. Please go ahead.
Apologies, forgot to lower the. I don't have a question.
Okay, great. Let me proceed. Here are some results. Once we construct this NRD exposure measure, we sort firms into different portfolios based on this measure, from firms with the highest risk disclosure exposure to the lowest. And we look at portfolio characteristics for all these 5 different portfolios. And first of all, I want to highlight there seems to be a negative correlation between the NRD exposure measure and market beta. So that tells us, market beta is not something that we are capturing. And it doesn't have a linear relation with book to market, but it has a very strong linear relation with size. So bigger firms tend to have higher risk exposure. And the other variable with a strong correlation with NRD exposure is profitability. More profitable firms tend to have higher risk exposure. And the last variable that has a strong correlation is investment, which is the final column. This is investment level. And it says firms with very low investment level, this is investment change, investment growth. Firms with very low investment growth tend to have high narrative risk exposure. So in a nutshell, I think what we're capturing here is firms that look like Walmart. Those are the firm, McDonald's, Starbucks. These are mature firms, large mature firms, and profitable with very low investment growth because they have already entered a mature stage. These firms tend to have high risk exposure relative to the market. Yes, Yan Yang, please.
Hi, Miao. I think that those statistics are very interesting. So the NRD exposure somehow is a perception by the managers, right? Because this is based on their disclosure. And then somehow the asset pricing model, when we talk about risk premium and exposure to the risk premium, we somehow want to kind of capture what actually realized, right? Like whether the firm's actually really sensitive to currency, not whether the manager feel they are sensitive to a certain risk. So can you tell us a little bit more on what are the determinants of this NRD exposure? Like what kind of for example, investor relations resources or strategies, or what type of the executive management style, all the other things potentially would change the perception of a firm's risk sensitivity to a certain topic, but that could be deviating from the actual risk exposure.
Oh, that's a very good point. And unfortunately, I don't have a good answer because I never tested this relation between NRD exposure and all these characteristics that you just mentioned. But I think it will be a very useful test to run. An underlying premise that we're trying to build here is managers' disclosure contains valuable information to investors. That requires managers to have a pretty good knowledge about their company and willing to share that knowledge to the investors. So I think, if I run a regression, regressing risk disclosure on a bunch of characteristics that you mentioned, that might help us to understand what managers characteristic or firm characteristics help investors to know, these are the managers whose disclosure are informative. Okay. Well, this is our first test, a traditional portfolio test to examine whether investors incorporate this NRD exposure information into prices. So we sort portfolios based on NRD exposure from high to low in quintiles, and we test if portfolios that contain firms with high NRD exposure earns a higher expected return. Right? These portfolios are sorted annually, of course, because our data is from 10K, but the portfolio returns are monthly. So it looks like when we put into all these pharma French 3-factor, 4-factor, 5-factor, 5 factors, the NRD does explain expected return in the sense that firms that have high risk exposure, high NRD exposure, earns a higher expected return. And in terms of magnitude, if you look at the return difference between the lowest and highest quintile, the alpha varies between 5 and 9% annually, depending on the model. Next, we go to pharma backpath regression and look at whether that is also true at firm level. So we run pharma backpath cross-sectional regressions, and these are the monthly slope averaged across all months. We put in all these known factors that explains expected stock returns, and we find an RD exposure positively explains stock returns despite including other known factors or with and without industry fixed effects. So that is the first part of the paper. Okay.
And
we
I
have a
have a
question.
minor question. So like
Sure.
for this table, I noticed that your industry fixed effect is based on Pharma French 48. I wonder you can run the sensitivity analysis, kind of increasing the number of industries, because some of the topic you showed in appendix, for example, medical device, at some point, if you have a more granular industry, I don't think this is kind of to take away the result, but it's actually help us to interpret at how many of your topics are capturing macro level risks versus industry level risks. So as you are increasing the number of industry fixed effect over time, you can identify which industries still survive in that test once you have 200 or 300 industry, because that means that the result is actually picking up macroeconomic risk. And then that would be a nice connection with Federico's and his co-author's paper.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
We can do that for sure. Okay, so let me move to the second part of the paper. So far, we're trying to argue the NRD exposure brings valuable information to investors such that investors incorporate this information into stock prices. But if you think about the underlying data we're using to build this NRD exposure, these are unstructured textual data from item 1A. And not only we are asking investors to read or to process a focal firm's item 1A, we're asking investors a lot more than that. We're asking investors to process the correlation between the focal firm's item 1A and all the other firms' item 1A in that year. So this is very demanding task. So we don't expect investors to be able to incorporate all the valuable information very promptly. So we are trying to test that. Is there a lag in terms of how fast investors can process this information and incorporate this information into prices. So the way we do that is again a very conventional test of this lead and lag phenomenon. For every focal firm I, we calculate the correlation, the covariance between the focal firm I's risk topic distribution and every other firm J's risk topic distribution. And then we sort of aggregate up a focal firm I's risk peers performance every month. How we do that is for all the peers that has a positive overlap with the focal firm I in terms of risk topic distribution, we look at this peer firm's stock return. And we aggregate all the focal firm I's peers stock return weighted by the peers market cap. That will give us what we call a focal firm I's risk peers return. And we're going to test if the focal firm's risk peers current period return can predict the focal firm's return in the next period. If that is the case, it suggests that investors can actually use a focal firm's risk peers return to predict what's going to happen to the focal firm's return in the next period. That is evidence of the focal firm's risk information is not incorporated very promptly into the focal firm's current period return. That's a sort of a standard lead lag effect. Yes.
So I think you are running into Hober and Phillips space, right? So like your weighted, so the slide before, the way that you calculated is based on item 1A, and then they are using the item 1 to come up with who are the peers of a focal firm. So that you may want to control for that, or kind of like try to talk about how does the item 1A will capture different type of peers that item 1 would not otherwise pick it up. Yep.
Yes, that's a good point. We do a little bit of that, but I think we can do more. Federico?
Yeah, so I was thinking the following. There is a pretty extensive literature that finds that risk factor disclosures effectively influence investors' risk perceptions in short windows around the filing of a 10K or any other types of disclosures. And this literature does not exclusively focus on idiosyncratic risk, but also captures systematic risk. So I'm wondering whether there is an opportunity for you to try and differentiate the systematic risk factors that investors seem to be able to process more promptly versus the systematic risk factors that investors process with a delay. Because obviously this literature, again, suggests that there is some systematic information that is processed in a timely fashion.
That's a very interesting question. So far, we don't have a way in terms of measuring stuff to distinguish between idiosyncratic risk components versus systematic risk component of risk disclosure. But if you compare our results, our previous results, sorting portfolios and test returns in the current quarter versus the result I'm going to show you in a minute, how much of that information seems to be delayed and help to explain focal firm's stock return in the next period, the magnitude seems to be very similar. So I'm wondering if I can take that as evidence and argue, look, there is about half of the systematic risk information got incorporated into prices very promptly, and the other half seems to got delayed into future periods. But let me think a little bit more about that. That's a good question. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to sort portfolios based not on the focal firm's NRD exposure, but instead on the focal firm's peers risk in the previous period, and test if focal firms who have risk peers that do extremely well in the previous period those focal firms are more likely to do well in the current period and vice versa. So this is the portfolio test, and it seems that the focal firm's risk peers performance in the previous period have a strong predictability of the focal firm's performance in the current period, suggesting it takes time for investors to incorporate information in risk disclosure. And that message also goes through in firm level tests using from a Macbeth approach. So here, the NRD return, T minus one, is the focal firm's risk peers return in the last month. And the dependent variable is the return of the focal firm in the current month. So there seems to be a strong positive correlation between those two things, suggesting the focal firm's peers' performance in the previous period contains very valuable and predictable signal on the focal firm's performance in the current period.
Miao, may I ask a question about
Of
this
course, Jenny.
test? Yeah, what if you control for the focal firm's return in T minus one? The reason I'm asking is now the table shows the effect of the peers' return predictability, and we also know momentum based on a firm itself. How much is that effect can be consumed by a firm's own momentum, and how much is incremental to the focal firm's own momentum?
Well, this is a partial table because the whole table is really long, but you can see we controlled for the focal firm's return in the previous month, which is return T minus one. So the coefficient is negative because at that frequency there is a reversal. This is short-term
Is there?
reversal.
Yeah.
But I believe we also control for focal firm's return in a longer horizon in the past, which help us to capture momentum.
Yeah, I see it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and we also test whether what we're trying to capture here is not due to a confounding way to classify which firms are the focal firm's peer, right?
We have a question from the chat real quick that I'm going to read to you from Peter Pope. Does the NRD measure not sort negatively on idiosyncratic risk? If a firm has loss of medical device type topics, then it will have lower correlation with market NRD and therefore low NRD, but high idiosyncratic volatility.
That makes sense, right? If a firm is talking about everything that all the other firms on the market are also talking about, there should be no idiosyncratic volatility, right? The firm should co-move perfectly with the market. But on the other extreme, yes, if the firm is talking about things that most of the other firms don't talk about, we should predict this firm has high idiosyncratic volatility. I should test that. That's a good way to sort of validate this measure. Thank you. Okay, so what we're trying to show here in this table is we're not capturing other types of peers. For example, firms working in the same industry, firms that have that locates in the same size group, etc. But we should do a little bit more here because we have other documented peer effects in the literature, such as the Holmberg-Phillips classification. We have firms that share the same analyst, etc. There are plenty of other things that we need to test to show this result is robust.
And I think Peter has another suggestion as to whether if this is another proxy for idiosyncratic volatility, therefore just controlling for idiosyncratic volatility effects in your stock returns.
Controlling for idiosyncratic volatility. Sounds good. Hey, Dan, do you have a question?
Yeah, so more like a comment. I think one way to kind of distinguish the effects documented in this paper from the extant literature on the momentum spillover effect could be that the NRD here is derived from the textual information, which is arguably highly sophisticated and not easy to decipher. And I think this argument aligns with Cohn et al. 2020 the lazy prices paper. I think you cited this paper, but I'm wondering if you're considered to, do more to allude to this idea.
That's a good point. So we might be able to sort of follow the Cohen et al. Paper and see if there's a notable change in the way that firms, well, because we measure NRD exposure and sort portfolio annually. We update data every year, so we should be able to capture a little bit of that, but probably not completely, right? Federico has a paper in TAR showing us, if there's a noticeable change in item 1A that contains a lot of information in terms of firms' risks, and that risk got priced in the financial market. So let me think a little bit more along that dimension. Okay, so this is the last table I would like to show you, and this table tells us a little bit why these peer risk information got slowly incorporated into focal firms' stock returns. So we categorize focal firms into big size group, small size group, or high attention group, low attention group, or high institutional holding group, low institutional holding group, and high number of analyst group and low number of analyst group. So what we document here is firms that receive more market attention measured by Google search, size, institutional holdings. They don't have as much lead lag effect as firms that receive low attention from the market, and firms that have a higher cost to arbitrage as captured by, for example, institutional holdings or illiquidity. They have a longer delay in how fast investors incorporate peers' information into focal firm stock prices. So this is consistent with this limited attention from investors' literature. So okay, we have another question. Shibao?
Yeah, hi Miao. This is Shibao. I'm a fifth-year PhD student from UIC. Very interesting paper. I also studied this in my job market paper. So one of the comment from in the practice or the industry or even from the literature is that risk factor disclosure are like boilerplate. So there's recent paper look at the change of the risk factor disclosure to look at some of the new information. How do you think that will affect your story in your paper and all of these results?
Yes. The boilerplate concern is well taken. And changes in risk factor indeed might contain a more signal, and that might be a way to help us filter out noises in boilerplate disclosure. Let me think a little bit more about the best way to do it. Right, Federico's paper might give me a hint, but I need to think a little bit harder. Okay, that's a good question. Yes, Federico.
I was just gonna say that, yeah, changes will help, but to some extent, I really like the idea that as your primary research measure and design, you're not looking at changes because essentially you're trying to capture a time varying beta, not a change in a time varying beta,
Yes.
right? So that's something you want to keep in mind. So, the change might help your later tests, but I don't think looking at changes should be affecting your primary measurement approach because of what you're trying to capture.
I like that. Thank you. Okay. Now, let me conclude and perhaps spend a few minutes talking about policy implications. So I see this paper as a effort to measure firms' risk disclosure, but not from a idiosyncratic perspective, but from a systematic perspective, and show that once we can capture a firm's risk disclosure and its correlation with all the other firms' risk disclosure, that help us to understand how a particular firm, the focal firm, connects to the market in terms of risk exposure, and that information helps investors to understand risk exposure of different firms and incorporate that information into stock prices. So why is this finding might be interesting to policymakers? Well, it suggests to us that the item 1A, the narrative risk disclosure, serves a dual role. Not only it tells us a firm's specific risk exposure, but it also tells us what are the risk topics that many firms are talking about. That is a information that an investor only gets by processing not the focal firm's risk disclosure, but all the firms on the market, how they disclose their risks. So in that sense, there is a spillover effect because when the focal firm discloses in their item 1A, it not only helps investor to understand the focal firm separately, how the focal firms are exposed to different risks, it also contributes to investors understanding what are the important risks that the market are having in the current period. From that perspective, mandating risk disclosure seems to be a good way to increase price efficiency. Because we know whenever there is positive externality, we don't have sufficient amount of information supply. However, the second part of the paper also shows evidence that this disclosure in item 1A seems to be very complex and structured, and it causes delay in how fast investors can incorporate this information into prices. So there seems to be room to improve how risks are disclosed in item 1A. That's, to me, are the policy implications.
And I think you had another point to add here.
Yeah, hi Miao. So ironically, we are talking about policy invocation on the election day. And I think the textual analysis actually kind of give us a lot of information about the nature of topics, right? So if you are going to kind of propose those implications to the Congress, I think people generally would like to know what type of risks are systematic risks that affect many firms in 1960, in 1970 versus today. And then going back to my first point at the beginning is that you think that you frame your paper as a contributing to highlight the emergent risks, but you never told us what those risks are, right? Like one question would be, is actually environmental risk picked up by your measure after 2010, after 2020, or actually still those traditional industrial type of risks are captured by your measure in today's economy. I think shedding light a little bit on the nature of the risks changing over time based on your time-varying textual-based risk factor will really kind of amplify the implications to not only the literature and also non-academic audience, right? Because that is the nuance compared to earnings beta or stock return based beta that we don't know what we capture. We only know it's significantly correlated with future stock returns, but we cannot talk anything about the economic details.
You're right. You're right. So far, our approach again is sort of like a black box. It doesn't, well, it doesn't prevent us to run all the regressions we want to run, but it does give us a very big limitation on in terms of how much we can interpret our findings in terms of economics of risks. So I think there are two ways ahead. One is to sort of leverage Federico and Jenny's suggestion and look at titles that companies put in those risk disclosures. The other is something that I'm currently trying. Our LDA give us not topics of risks, but a bunch of keywords that tend to show up together and drop all the contextual information around those keywords. But here, when we think about contextual information being dropped by LDA, I wonder if large language models can help us to bring those back. So one thing I'm currently trying to do is look, we feed all these keywords from an unnamed topic from LDA into ChatGPT and ask GPT to give us a few paragraphs. These are the words that you have to use in writing a few paragraphs, mimicking a company's item 1A. How would you write them? And I can do that. I can prompt that to GPT several times and ask GPT to give us maybe 100 versions of paragraphs using these keywords. And then I will ask GPT, look, what are you talking about? Give me the topic of what you just wrote, right? I do this because there's randomness in GPT, content generating. I can do this, repeat this process many times, sort of analogous to a bootstrapping exercise. And that might help us to break up the black box. Jenny.
Miao, I really like the idea of looking at the exposure to systematic risk from companies' risk factor disclosure. Shibao's comment earlier about the boilerplating made me realize. Think about an article published in Accounting Review a few years ago. That article looked at so-called boilerplate disclosure of risk factor, and they look at from the regulator SEC's perspective, also look at from the court perspective. The idea is that on the one hand, the SEC didn't like companies to just say whatever other companies are also saying because those risk factors are not specific. And on the other hand, court systems, and so that their study divide the firms into one type where with the court system really look at in fact can use the so-called boilerplate as court evidence that can those so-called boilerplate can help the firm in court. So I'm just thinking now when you look at the overlap of the risk factors, maybe you could divide a sample into one group which could where this similarity with other firms could help them in court. Then that means these firms have an incentive of saying what other firms are saying, even though it may not be their true risk factor, and then separate from the other type of firms which didn't have these the court related incentive.
That sounds very interesting. Let me see if I can try to find that paper. If not, I'll bug you.
Send it to you. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll send you the name. Yeah.
Thank you, Jenny. Okay. If there's no more question, last but not the least, we have an announcement of the next ADP workshop coming up in 2 weeks. But the time is a little bit different from our usual time. It's in the morning Eastern time from 9 to 10. And Christina is gonna give us a presentation on a very exciting topic towards a new financial statement analysis.